Awesome. Well, my name is Matt Woodruff, as you mentioned. I'm a software developer at Bison Technologies. And today I'm going to give you a very high-level overview of the Flux pattern and two of its common implementations, Redux being the most popular and Vuex. So first off, what is Flux? Flux is a pattern created by Facebook that they use to manage state in their applications. So why did Facebook create Flux? So originally, Facebook was using the MVC pattern, and they ran into a strange bug where their notification icon would pop up and say there was a notification, but then when the user would click it, it would go away and there would be no new notification. That created a pretty poor experience for the users. And there was apparently only one person on their team that was really good with that MVC pattern. And apparently it led to some confusion and bad code, and that created that bug. So they came up with this Flux pattern, which is a unidirectional data flow that uses a unidirectional data flow. And because it does that and it processes things in a certain order, it creates predictable data, which leads to easier debugging and testing. The one thing I really like about the Flux pattern that we use at work is it keeps our component views very declarative. So if I have like an API that I want to hit and get a response back with some data and then do some transformation or aggregation on that data and then store it in my state, I don't have to do that in my component. I can throw that in an action, and it's all abstracted away. It's very declarative in my component, so I know exactly what it's doing. And if I want to know how it's doing it, I can go to that action and take a look. The other thing it does is separate the data state from your view state. So next, I'll go over kind of like an abstract flow of what Flux does. So you have your view, and it gets its state from the store. And once it initially loads, it will pull the initial state from the store and then call an action. An action might change the state, it might not. But the action is then passed to the dispatcher, and the dispatcher is, it's kind of like a traffic controller. It gets all these actions and then executes them in the order that it gets them. The dispatcher will then change state, update the store, and then the view will react to that update. From a very high level generic overview, that's kind of how it works. So next we'll go into Redux. Redux is the most popular Flux implementation, and it's used pretty heavily with React. Redux's flow is a little bit different, but it's pretty much the same. So you have your React component. Your React component dispatches an action. That action then calls a reducer that returns a new slice of state, and that new slice of state triggers a re-render in the component. So this is an example I wrote for this demo of a functional component that's using Redux to manage its state. You'll see that it uses a uselector hook to grab the count state from the count module. And then it has a couple of local functions that are calling dispatchers to update your state. And then down in the template, you'll see that I've bound those local functions to the onClick event, and that will increment and decrement the counter. So an example of those actions will look something like this. And these particular actions are very simple. They don't have anything being passed into them. They're just doing a very specific thing. So you just have a type, you have no payload. So that type is then passed to your reducer. And depending on what type of action is called, it will render a new slice of state immutably. It will not change the current state. It will take the current state and return a new state based on what type it is and what you tell it to do. So that's pretty basic implementation of Redux. And now we'll move on to Vuex, which is something I'm a little more familiar with. I use Vue a lot at work. So it's a little bit different of a workflow as well. So within your component, your Vue component, you can either commit a mutation or you can dispatch an action. So it's not limited to just actions. If you do choose to dispatch an action, Vuex Actions are all, they support asynchronicity by default. So you don't have to use a thunk if you want to do something asynchronously, whereas in React you would. Or you can just call a straight up mutation. If it's pretty declarative and you don't have a bunch of logic, then you just call the mutation, change your state. And then you have these things called getters, and getters are basically computed properties. The computed properties watch the state as a dependency, and when that state changes, it triggers a re-render in your component. Here is a basic example of the exact same counter application in Vue using Vuex. So at the top, you have your template, and it has your counter, your count, and then it binds these click events to these different functions local to your class. Inside your class, I've used decorators to map my getters, mutations, and actions to my class, which keeps it pretty simple. But yeah, it's just reaching in, grabbing a mutation, an action, or a getter, and doing what it needs to do. So here's an example of an action. With my actions, I've kind of come into the habit of keeping all my strings enumerable in an object so that I can pull them out whenever I want and use them. Also, I really like this because when I console log my mutations, I get a description of what it was trying to mutate if it ever threw an error. And then you'll see the action. The action takes in, the first parameter is the store, and I'm destructuring that, pulling out commit. I'm making a fake API request and then committing that mutation. And here would be an example of a Vuex mutation, and the mutation is straight up mutating your state. So it keeps it pretty simple, but you got to be careful because it does mutate your state. So with JavaScript, if you assign it an object and you mutate that object, the original object is mutated as well. So those are some nuances you might run into. And next we come to getters. Getters are basically just computed properties. So you expose a certain piece of state within your getter, and your getter will provide that state when it changes. Some of the key differences between Redux and Vuex. Redux is immutable. It uses reducers to return a new slice of state. You have to call an action to change state. And for asynchronous actions, you would have to use a thunk. Vuex is mutable. It can call a mutation directly from the component without an action. And if you have something that's really imperative or requires it asynchronous behavior, then you can just throw that into an action and then get the state mutated however you want. So that kind of concludes my talk. Here are some of the resources that I used in researching. There's a link to Flux, Redux, Vuex, and that counter example in both React and Vue are available at my GitHub at woody34/flux.